There was an article that was purported to have been written by her in one of the magazine, one of the Star or whatever those terrible things are, in which she made certain assertions and accusations that none of us ever believed a word of it.
There's a moment in television history that almost never made it to air. A single scene, tucked into the closing minutes of a beloved sitcom's final episode, that network executives fought against right up until broadcast day. It lasted less than 90 seconds. It broke a rule that television had followed since the medium was invented. And in the strangest way possible, it may have been the exact moment that sealed the show's fate. Not with a bang, but with a quiet goodbye that the network didn't know how to follow. This is the story of how Happy Days ended, why the ending almost didn't happen the way audiences remember it, and how one unusual creative choice became both the show's most celebrated moment and the reason it could never come back. By the early 1980s, Happy Days had been on the air for the better part of a decade. What started as a lighthearted look back at 1950s Wisconsin had grown into one of the most watched programs in America, spinning off multiple other series, launching the careers of its young cast, and turning a supporting biker character into a genuine cultural icon. But by its 10th and 11th seasons, the show that had once dominated Tuesday nights was aging. Ratings had cooled. Original cast members had already left for other projects. The network was quietly aware that the Cunningham family story was reaching its natural end. Ending a hit show gracefully is one of the hardest things a network can do. A series finale isn't just another episode. It's a promise to the audience that the years they spent with these characters meant something. Get it right, and it becomes a piece of television history. Get it wrong, and it can undo a decade of goodwill in a single evening. Happy Days' creative team understood this pressure better than almost anyone at the network did, and that difference in understanding is where the real conflict of the story begins. As the writers began shaping the final episodes, they wanted the ending to feel different from anything the show had done before. 11 years of episodes had followed a strict formula. The audience watched the Cunninghams live their lives from behind an invisible wall, never acknowledged, never spoken to. It was the basic contract of the sitcom format. The idea that emerged for the finale broke that contract entirely. The plan was for Howard Cunningham, the steady, quietly wise father at the center of the family, to turn toward the camera in the show's closing scene and speak directly to the people watching at home. Not as a character delivering a line to another character, but as a man thanking an audience for the years they had spent together. It was a small technical change on paper. In practice, it meant tearing down the wall the show had built its entire identity around. Executives were uneasy the moment they heard it. Breaking that kind of separation between fiction and audience was considered a serious risk in the industry at the time. There was a real fear that stepping outside the world of the story, even for a few seconds, would remind viewers they were watching a television set instead of a family, and that the emotional spell the show had cast for over a decade would shatter in an instant. Network notes came back cautioning against it. Alternative versions of the closing scene were requested. The creative team held their ground, arguing that after this many years, the audience had earned more than a scripted goodbye between characters. They deserved to be spoken to directly. To understand why this argument mattered so much, it helps to remember what Happy Days represented by 1984. It wasn't simply a hit show anymore. It was part of the rhythm of people's weeks. Families had watched the Cunningham children grow up in something close to real time. A leather-jacketed side character had become one of the most recognizable figures in American pop culture. An entire wave of nostalgia for the 1950s had been shaped, at least in part, by this one series. For a show with that kind of cultural weight, the finale wasn't just closing a storyline. It was closing a decade of shared experience for millions of households. The writers believed that moment deserved acknowledgement, not another tidy plot resolution wrapped in a bow. The network's caution wasn't unreasonable either. Television in the early 80s ran on the illusion of an unbroken fictional world, and there was no guarantee that breaking it wouldn't feel gimmicky or hollow instead of sincere. Both sides were, in their own way, trying to protect the show's legacy. They simply disagreed on how. What ultimately allowed the scene to survive wasn't a network mandate or a last-minute change of heart from an executive. It was persistence from the people who had shaped the show for over a decade, combined with a final agreement to shoot the scene simply, without spectacle, so that if it didn't work, it could be trimmed in the edit. When filming day arrived, the scene was shot quietly, almost anticlimactically. There was no elaborate staging, no dramatic musical swell written into the moment beforehand. Just a father, in the family's familiar living room, looking into the lens and speaking plainly about the years that had passed, the children who had grown, and the gratitude he felt for having shared it all with the people watching. It ran only briefly, and when it aired as part of the show's final broadcast in the spring of 1984, it did something the network hadn't fully prepared for. Audiences didn't feel distanced by the moment. They felt included in it. Rather than reminding viewers they were watching actors on a soundstage, the scene made millions of people feel as though the family they had followed for over a decade was thanking them personally for staying. Letters poured in afterward from viewers who described crying a moment that, by every rule of the era's television craft, wasn't supposed to work.
Critics were divided at first. Some called it sentimental. Others called it a masterstroke. But over the following months and years, something interesting happened. The scene became the moment most associated with the show's ending, referenced again and again whenever people discussed how a long-running series should say goodbye. It had taken an enormous creative risk and, against the network's own instincts, it had landed. Here is where the story becomes more complicated than a simple triumph. The scene worked precisely because it functioned as a full stop. It wasn't written as a transition into more episodes or a soft landing before future specials. It was constructed emotionally as an ending, the kind of ending that tells an audience the story is finished and it's safe to let go. That created an unusual problem for the network in the months that followed. Happy Days still had a handful of already produced episodes sitting unaired, delayed earlier in the season by scheduling conflicts with other programming commitments. Under ordinary circumstances, a network might have simply aired those leftover episodes later in the summer as if nothing unusual had happened. But this finale hadn't left room for later. The emotional finality of that closing scene meant that anything the network tried to air afterward would land not as a continuation, but as an intrusion on something audiences had already accepted as complete. When those remaining episodes did eventually air months later, they were met with confusion rather than enthusiasm. Viewers had already said goodbye. The Cunningham family reappearing on screen after such a definitive farewell felt less like a bonus and more like a rerun that had wandered in by mistake. Ratings for those trailing episodes were modest at best, and industry observers at the time noted the disconnect between the emotional high point of the finale and the quiet, almost apologetic energy of what came after. In that sense, the scene that made the ending unforgettable was also the scene that made any true continuation impossible. It closed the door so effectively that nothing produced afterward could walk back through it convincingly. The show wasn't canceled by falling ratings alone, and it wasn't undone by cast departures or creative exhaustion. It was, in an odd and almost poetic way, ended by its own goodbye. Once an audience has been thanked and released, there is no version of just one more episode that feels like anything but an afterthought. What might have been a footnote in television trivia instead became something of a case study. Producers and network executives on other long-running series began paying closer attention to how their own shows might end, wary of either mishandling a finale's emotional weight or scheduling additional content in a way that would undercut it. The lesson many took from Happy Days' send-off was straightforward. Once you tell your audience the story is over, mean it. A finale is not just another hour of programming to be slotted in wherever convenient. It is a promise, and breaking that promise, even accidentally, costs a show more goodwill than most executives expect. Over the following years, networks became noticeably more careful about the order in which they burned off remaining episodes of ending series, and more thoughtful about how final a finale was allowed to feel before the last frame aired. It became something of an unwritten rule in the industry. Don't let your ending arrive before your episodes are actually finished airing. For the people in front of the camera that day, the scene carries a different kind of weight decades later. It represented, in many ways, the closing of a chapter that had defined a huge portion of their working lives. The actor who delivered that closing address had spent over a decade inside a single household, playing a father figure so steady and reassuring that audiences genuinely mourned him when he passed away years later, treating the loss with the kind of grief usually reserved for an actual family member. The rest of the ensemble scattered into very different corners of the industry afterward. Some moved from acting into directing and found extraordinary success behind the camera. Others struggled for years with the shadow the show's most famous character cast over their careers, only rebuilding their reputations through unexpected roles much later in life. A few faded from the spotlight altogether, choosing quieter careers away from Hollywood. And for at least one beloved cast member, the years following the show's end were marked by real personal hardship that the public rarely saw at the time. Decades later, surviving members of the cast have reunited on stage more than once to revisit that era, often specifically referencing the finale's closing scene as the moment that captured what the show truly meant to the people who made it and the people who watched it. It remains, by a wide margin, the single moment from the series most frequently brought up whenever its legacy is discussed. It's tempting to look at this as a simple tale of network executives being wrong and creative instinct being right. But the more interesting truth is messier than that. The network wasn't wrong to worry that breaking the fourth wall could backfire. It very easily could have. And the writers weren't simply lucky. They understood something about their audience that the executives, focused on the mechanics of scheduling and risk, hadn't fully accounted for, that after 11 years, viewers didn't just want a resolved plot. They wanted acknowledgement. The irony is that the very success of that acknowledgement is what made everything produced afterward feel unnecessary. A finale that lands with real emotional force doesn't leave room for footnotes. It doesn't want a coda. Once an audience has cried at a goodbye, bringing the characters back for a few more light-hearted half-hours doesn't feel like a treat. It feels like static after the song has ended. That is the real reason this single scene is remembered as the moment that took the show off the air for good. Not because it was a mistake, and not because it failed. It succeeded so completely at being an ending that the show could never convincingly be anything else again. In trying to give its audience the most honest goodbye television had attempted up to that point, the finale did its job so well that it left no room for an encore, and in doing so, it became one of the most quietly influential moments in the history of the sitcom. Television has given audiences plenty of famous final scenes over the decades, but few of them carry the strange distinction this one does. A moment so effective at closing a story that it effectively closed the door on the show itself. It's a reminder that in storytelling, knowing how to end something well is its own kind of skill, one that can outweigh ratings, contracts, and even a network's own plans. Sometimes the bravest creative choice a show can make is simply saying goodbye, and meaning it.